Hi, my name is Amanda Sears. I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. Today is March 3rd, and we're going to talk about what to plant now and how to grow it. Here in Kentucky, we have three gardening seasons. There's spring, summer, and fall. Summer is what we normally think of as our garden season, where we would grow peppers and tomatoes and beans, corn. But spring, there are tons of things to plant, and then the fall garden really mimics the spring. So today we're going to talk about the spring and tips for growing different things in the garden during this time of year. And I just wanted to update everybody that the Home Vegetable Gardening Guide has been revised this year and is out. And I do have a link to that PDF at the end of this presentation. First thing I wanted to mention was how important crop rotation is in the garden. And a lot of times people think, well, I had tomatoes in this area of the garden last year. I'll plant potatoes there this year. But that is not true rotation because they're in the same plant family. And so what I would recommend is instead choosing something that's in a different family, in this case, a different circle. So if you had tomatoes in one spot this year, next year you might put pumpkins or squash, maybe a cabbage or corn, and that would be a true rotation. Now, for a lot of the diseases and insects that we're rotating to get rid of, the rotation probably needs to be at least 3 or 4 years, or as long as you can actually manage it would be great. And I know that's sometimes complicated in small gardens or in raised beds. So we just do the best we can. You know, if you don't put tomatoes or pumpkins or whatever plant in the same spot every year, even if you do have a raised bed, just try to move things as best you can. And this hopefully will break up some of the cycle of disease. So we're also going to talk a bit about cool season versus warm season crops. And what we would grow now are considered cool season. And that is those that grow in cooler temperatures and that tolerate light frost. Although it is March 3rd and it's a beautiful sunny day here, it is not the end of winter. And we may still have plenty of cold and snowy weather ahead of us. And so it's much too early to plant a lot of the crops, but the plants on the right-hand side, the vegetables and the table, can be planted now and in April. And you can see spinach, for instance, could have already been going into the ground. And so the opposite of cool season would be warm season. And those you would plant after the threat of frost has passed, so after May 10th. And those require a warmer soil and air temperature. I will point out, and I'm going to talk about it in the next slide a bit more, but notice that broccoli and cauliflower, when they're both recommended to be planted outside April 5th, but in both cases, it's recommended to use plants instead of seeds. And just to mention that here, some plants take so long to mature from the time you seed it to the time you harvest that it makes sense to start them inside earlier. And so by starting them inside in a greenhouse or maybe in a kitchen under a grow light, you're starting that plant earlier and you can put it out in the garden, and then you have a little bit of a head start because the growing season for it is so long. If you were to plant it from seed, it would take so long from planting outside with the seed to maturity, the temperatures might be warmer and it may not grow as well. So while you can still plant those from seed outside, it is recommended to maybe start them inside. The other plants on that list can grow very well from seed and put it in the garden. You can also plant those inside if you wanted to get a head start. But on those two in particular, because their seasons are so much longer. So one other thing to consider is hardening off your plants if you do start them inside. And that basically just means you are not putting your baby plants directly out into the garden. And if you think about it, they've basically been babied. You've given them all the water, all the fertilizer, all the light that they have needed for however long you've been growing them. And now you don't want to just put them out into the elements because they may not be strong enough. And so what you want to do is you want to start to reduce the amount of water that you're giving them and slowly acclimate them to the direct sunlight and outside conditions. And while it's recommended to do it for 2 weeks, I know that seems like a really long time, So at least do, several days a week where you're putting them outside and letting them get used to the outside conditions before you throw them out into the garden. So on the day you do want to transplant to outside, and you want to make sure and dig your hole and give a good soaking prior to setting the plants out. Ideally, calm winds and overcast days would be good. And you want to plant the plant at the same depth and spacing that's recommended if you're doing seeds. But also, I'm sorry, for transplants, you would want to have the correct depth that they are in the container that they're being grown in. And the exception to that would be tomatoes, which we're not growing in the spring garden, but I just wanted to mention they can be planted deeper. And of course, plant at the correct time. And what we're mentioning today are the cool season crops. So for soil bed prep, if this is a new bed, you need to remove any existing plants such as the turf and the weeds. And that can be done several different ways. A lot of times people think that you need some equipment or a big tractor, but really, just if it's a small garden, consider just killing out the turf and the weeds with something like a cardboard over the area or black plastic that'll kill everything out. It's not a quick process. You probably would have wanted to start in the fall, maybe even, but that is another way to kill out, and you would have to hand remove the turf and the weeds. And you want to work that area down to 6 to 10 inches deep. And I always think adding organic matter to a new or existing garden site is a great idea, and I'll mention what organic matter is in a second. And once you have that bed created, you want to make sure and rake the surface until it's smooth and free of large clumps, especially if you're planting seeds, because you want to have a good seed to soil contact and a good seed bed to come that's smooth. Do not work in wet soil because that can cause compaction. And here in Central and East Kentucky, we have been plagued with floods this last week, and we just had a ton of rain and ice storms. And so this is especially at the forefront of my mind, as it is starting to become the season where we want to start working in our gardens. How do you know if it's too wet to walk in your garden? You can actually make a mud ball, basically, or make a ball out of the soil, drop it like on your shoe. If it breaks apart, it's dry enough to get into the garden. If it stays together, it's too wet. And if you're not sure, just give it a little more time to dry. If you go into a garden and it's wet, whether that's walking or equipment, it'll compact the pore spaces in the soil. And you need those pore spaces to hold water and air for plant health. And once those are compacted, you can't correct that problem. And so what you have is, rather than correcting a problem, you're just going to have to deal with a problem at that point. So it's just some things to think about. I would also mention at this point, although it's kind of related to wet soil, but just compaction in general, don't run equipment in wet soil, but don't run equipment any more than you need to anyway. I've talked to a lot of people over the last few years who rototill constantly because that's just the way they were brought up to do, to kill weeds and to get the soil the way they think they want it, and it has led to some compaction issues that they've seen with plants just not growing as well. So just a few things to keep in mind. Organic matter is basically made up of living, dead, and decomposing plants, small animals, and microorganisms. And soil itself is full of microorganisms working together to help with plant growth. And so organic matter can be used as a fertilizer. It would be considered slow release. It loosens and improves drainage. Although it can't reverse compaction, it can help to combat that issue. And it adds nitrogen and other nutrients as it decays. So a couple of examples would be aged manure or composted leaves. So either of those I would consider compost. Now I would mention that I would, whatever compost I'm using, I would want to make sure it no longer looks like what it originally was. And by that I mean, if I'm using aged manure, it shouldn't look or smell like manure anymore. It should basically look like soil. And the same is true with composted leaves or debris or anything else. If it is not aged enough, then what happens is sometimes as it breaks down in the soil, it can actually affect how nutrients are taken up by the plants. And so you end up having a little bit of a problem. And two, you want that manure to be very aged for food safety issues as well. I'm a big advocate of using mulch in the garden. A lot of times, well, pretty much every year, I'll use a couple of layers of newspaper, and then on top of that, I will put straw. This past year, because of COVID, I didn't get out to the stores, and so I used grass clippings, and that worked really well too. And the reason there's several reasons, but the biggest reason that I do this is disease management, because a lot of diseases live in the soil. And what happens is as it rains, then what happens, the rain droplets hit the soil and it jumps back onto the plant. And that's how a lot of infections begin to occur. So by creating that barrier there, you're actually making it harder for those diseases to infect those plants. And this might be a tool that you could use if you were having issues with trying to rotate like you should. It also prevents the soil from drying out, which can be a problem later in the year. And in general, just weed control. It makes it much easier because then I don't have to go in and hoe or run a rototiller. This also helps with blossom end rot. I know that pictures of a tomato when we're talking cool season crops, but the same is true. Now, of course, if you had like a bunch of leaf lettuce, you wouldn't put straw around every plant, but maybe around the planting itself. Now, with pests and diseases, I think the biggest thing is to check the garden often before small problems explode into something huge. Things like aphids, small disease problems, you can actually go in. If you see the problem, you can remove it, kill the insect. But if you wait, things get out of hand quickly. And so a few things to keep in mind. Only 10% of insects are actually pests. And so the other ones are just kind of hanging out or beneficial. And so you want to make sure before you start to spray or control that the insects you do see are the pests. And so if you're having problems, don't just assume that it is the insects that are there. Really look, doing research. And I'm here too. If you have questions on what are problems, I'm here to answer and help you identify things. So remember, make sure you know what the pest is. If you do see it, you can put them in soapy water and that'll drown them. You can squish them. But I would also like to just tell you, if possible, don't use a broad spectrum pesticide. By doing that, you're actually going to kill out everything, and that's going to be the good and the bad and the not doing anything. And what's going to happen is, since your beneficials have died, then the bad insects will probably come back in higher numbers. So very important to kind of know what the problem is. With diseases, we want good soil drainage and also air drainage. So we don't want plants planted too closely together. We want to avoid compaction. And I would recommend soil testing to see about things like nutrient levels and soil pH. And then, like I already mentioned, rotation is very important in that as well. So I have a few tips for growing the plants in the spring garden. So with beets and radishes, you might want to use successive planting, and that can be used with a lot of the different vegetables I'm going to mention in a moment. But succession means that you're going to actually plant some now, and then you're going to wait 2 or 3 weeks and you're going to plant some again, and you're going to wait 2 or 3 weeks and you're going to plant some more then. And that way, you're spreading out the harvest season as well. So everything isn't going to be coming in at once. A lot of these, beets and radishes, turnips are things that can maybe store well, but things like leaf lettuce and kale, you would do successively as well, and those don't store as well. So do not plant these beets and radishes close together because with these root vegetables, it will affect the size of the root. And radishes become woody and also hot in hot weather. So the sooner you can plant them, the better. With carrots, I'm just from the people I've talked to who grow them, they don't always grow well in our heavy clay soil. And so what I would do is maybe try a raised bed or maybe even a container, a large pot, and grow them there. They do grow better in porous soils. So the carrot seed is slow to germinate, and so people often mix a few radish seeds in there, and that's true with also the radishes and the no, I'm sorry, with the turnips and the beets are also slow to germinate. So people often mix radish seeds in there to know where their rows are. And so what they can do then is they'll see where the radishes come up quicker, and then they'll know where their desirable plant is located. And then you can let the radishes grow a bit and harvest those before they'll have an impactful growth up towards the desirable vegetable you're growing. So turnips, when you're shopping for seed, make sure that you're picking the type that you want. And some varieties are grown for greens, meaning the greens that are above ground, and some are for the root. And I already mentioned the root does store well. I'm not exactly sure how long at this moment, but they do well in storage, whereas the greens are very healthy as well. Now, there are some varieties have both tops and roots, but some are bred for better greens or for better root. The seed for this is often broadcast seeded and then thinned. Remember, we don't want to be too close. And like those radishes, large turnips will become woody if you do not harvest them in time. Broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage are all closely related. And for the most part, and there are some other insects, but a lot of these have very similar pests, and they're all larvae of butterflies and moths. And for the larvae of butterflies and moths, you can actually use a selective insecticide called BT. And that's short for Bacillus thuringiensis, and that is derived from a naturally occurring bacteria in the soil. And it will kill the larvae of the Lepidoptera family, which is butterflies and moths. So since these vegetables are not usually something we consider flowering plants, I think it would be safe to use BT on these plants without having a big impact on our pollinators. And because it's selective, it won't be killing everything. There are other insects that impact broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage, but these loopers and other larvae caterpillars are usually the biggest problem. Broccoli, the top of the broccoli plant, what we eat, is actually a mass of flower buds that have not opened, which I always find kind of interesting. And if you look at it, you can kind of see that once you know to look. And so what we do is we pick them before they open. And I have seen like on salad bars where maybe they were using a lower quality broccoli. And if you look closely, they have already started to open. And so they were probably somewhat of a cull. So what you do is once the broccoli has reached a size that you find acceptable, you harvest the top. And once the top has been harvested, little side heads will start to form. And these will not be as big as the central head that you harvested, but they will be harvestable as well. With cauliflower, cauliflower itself does not grow naturally white. And if you go to the store, there are other colors of cauliflower like yellow, or like a very bright yellow. But naturally, it would actually turn brown as the sun hits it. And so cauliflower is actually blanched, meaning we don't let the sun hit it. And so what we do is we actually take the leaves growing around the curd, which is the white part, or the part that we eat, and you bring up leaves and tie them there so that it actually does not allow sunlight to hit that. And so whenever next time you're at the farmer's market and you're looking at the cauliflower, remember or realize that the farmer had to go to some extra steps to get to that beautiful white curd. And so just you might thank them for that extra work. With potatoes, we often hear the term potato seeds, but they're not really seeds. They're really just pieces of potatoes that have been cut up. And with each portion that had been cut, we want to have about 2 or 3 buds, which the arrow is pointing to a bud, and those are also called eyes. And normally, we would probably cut the potato up the day before we plan on planting. In each piece, we would hopefully have, I think, 2 to 3 buds, and we would let those dry, or the pieces dry, and then plant them that next day. And when we plant, we'll put them about 4 to 5 inches deep, or at least a foot, and at least a foot apart. A lot of times we plant potatoes in hills as well. With new potatoes versus mature, you probably heard the term new potatoes, and we have new potatoes and mature potatoes on the same plants. What happens is new potatoes are just immature, and those can be harvested when the plant from the plant when the flowers start to appear on the plant. And we don't always think of a potato plant as having flowers, so just watch. Earlier in the season, when it flowers, if you dig into the root system, you'll see some smaller potatoes, and those will have a thinner skin, and usually, depending on the variety, a creamier texture. So what you can do is harvest some of those new potatoes and then either harvest the whole plant, or if you want, leave the plant there, but put soil back around the root so that it continues to grow. And then you can harvest your mature potatoes 2 weeks after the vines die and after being nipped by frost. And the later or the longer you wait to harvest your potatoes, the longer I believe they will be fresh or stay good in storage or long-term storage. With leafy vegetables, and really leafy vegetables I think are probably the easiest to me thing to grow. If you're new to gardening or if you're gardening with somebody for the first time, I think that doing kale or spinach or lettuce, there's so many neat varieties, so many colors and textures and just taste that it's a great thing to start with. And a lot of times we can start from seed. Excuse me. You can use transplants, although these are such quick growers to harvest, from seed to harvest. It works really well that way. I already mentioned successively growing. This is another great example of something you can do that way. And basically, you just cut them when they are a suitable size. And some things react to being cut better than others. With some plants, you're going to get a second, third, fourth flush of leaves growing back. Make sure and harvest when they're dry because that will make a more storage a little easier. Now, as it gets hotter, plants will turn bitter and they'll put up a flower stalk, like in the picture on the right, and that's called bolting. Now, if you look in some gardening catalogs, and I'm thinking things like Johnny Seed, they have a lot of different varieties. There are some varieties that do better in hot weather than others. So if you're thinking of trying to grow leafy vegetables during the hot season, then look for some varieties that maybe are bred that way. Now, peas, you want to plant as soon as the ground is workable. And I think I mentioned earlier that we have had a lot of rain here, and so we can't actually get into our gardens very easily. But once we can, peas would be great to go ahead and plant. Again, succession planting. A lot of times I think that you need a trellis when you grow peas, but there are some dwarf varieties that you do not have to use a trellis. And then when you harvest, when the pods have filled, so ideally you don't want them to be not very full or too full if you're going to be eating the pod, maybe about half to 3/4 full. And then you would harvest and you can eat the pod or the bean or the peas. With onions, they're sold in sets, which are basically small bulbs, whether you're growing the green onions or the bulb onions. If you're growing green onions, you would harvest these when the tops are about 6 inches tall. For bulb onions, you want to harvest when 2/3 of the tops have fallen over. Here is a list of the sources that I use for this presentation, and you'll see at the bottom of this that the Home Vegetable Garden in Kentucky, which has been revised, can be found there. We don't have any copies here at the office currently, but when we do get some, I'd be happy to send those out or have you come by and pick them up. Here's more. The Center for Crop Diversification at the University of Kentucky is a great resource as well. You might want to check out. So my name again is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. I'm always here to answer any questions you have about gardening, lawn care, trees, whatever. So if you need to get a hold of me, my name or my email address is amanda.sears@uky.edu, and my phone number is 859-623-4072. Let me know if you ever need anything. Thanks. Have a great day.